I wanted to look with you this afternoon at the text in Philippians. Now, Philippians, as you know, that's a letter from the Apostle Paul to the church in the Roman colony of Philippi. Now, the church, it was founded during Paul's second missionary journey, probably in the latter part of AD 49 or the early part of 50. And you may recall that missionaries, including Silas, Timothy, and Luke, they went there in response to Paul's vision of a Macedonian man calling him to come over and help them. Philippi, let me see if I get, there you go. Philippi, do we have a little pointer here? But you see it up there. Philippi, it was a leading city in the Roman province of Macedonia. And it was the first major center where Paul preached the gospel in Europe. And the actual founding of the church you can read about in Acts chapter 16, verses 12 to 40. I think you'll remember that during their stay in Philippi, Lydia converted. Paul and Silas were illegally flogged and thrown in prison. The jailer converted. And the magistrates, after being told that Paul was a Roman citizen, they apologized and they asked him to leave the city. And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, Paul refers to the suffering and the insults that he received in Philippi on that occasion. Now, after leaving Philippi, Paul received material assistance from the brothers and sisters in that congregation, both when he was in Thessalonica and when he was in Corinth. And Paul visited the Macedonian churches, including the church in Thessalonica and Philippi, on at least 2 occasions in the mid-50s. And he maintained a very warm relationship with the Philippians throughout his life. Now, at the time of the writing of the letter we're looking at, Philippians, Paul is imprisoned. Now, he's probably in Rome. There's some debate about that, but he's probably in Rome. And though I titled the sermon, Lessons from a Roman Jail, Paul is, for all or at least most of his confinement in Rome at this time, Paul's under house arrest. And if Rome, if that's correct, if that's indeed the site of his imprisonment, the year is around AD 61 or 62, and this is near the end of his first imprisonment in that city. Now, Paul begins as he typically does. There's a salutation in the first couple of verses. There's a thanksgiving that he offers for them, and this follows standard letter format, which of course Paul Christianizes. But you have this thanksgiving for them in verses 3 through 8, and then there's a prayer report for them in verses 9 to 11. Where I wanted to start in verse 12 of chapter 1, where Paul says, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that the things concerning me have actually come about for the advancement of the gospel, so that my chains in the cause of Christ have become obvious throughout the whole palace guard and to all the rest. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my chains, are daring even more to speak the word fearlessly." And verse 12, when he says, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that the things concerning me," that his circumstances have actually come about for the advancement of the gospel, Paul is setting the record straight. There's been some kind of miscommunication or false report about Paul's circumstance and situation, and he's straightening it out. He wants them to know that his situation has actually come about for the advancement of the gospel. He's correcting that misunderstanding. Contrary to what some of the Philippians had heard or had been led to believe, his situation was actually a benefit to the cause of Christ, not a detriment. Somehow they'd been hearing that, no, this is really a negative thing. This is Paul messing up. He's harming the cause of Christ. And Paul's saying, no, I want you to know that it's really something that's a benefit to the cause of Christ. Now, precisely what circumstances Paul's referring to, it's not clear. He may simply be referring to the fact of his imprisonment. But some people think he's referring to something more recent, some more recent change. And it's possible that his prison situation had changed because in AD 62, the infamous Tigellinus, he became head of the Roman Praetorian Guard over the relatively honest Burrus. And the reason that's relevant is that until AD 63, Nero delegated the handling of appeals to the head of the Praetorian Guard. So if depending on the timing, if that's going on right when Paul's there, that may be what Paul is referring to. But Paul wants them to know that God is in control. You see, that his circumstances in no way represent a defeat for God. He also wants them to know that the gospel is advancing. He wants them to know that because they, like Paul, care about that. They're gospel people. So Paul wants them to know, look, God here is in control. This isn't a defeat for God. And I want you to know that the gospel that you and I love is in fact advancing. God is just amazing in how he accomplishes his purposes in ways we would not expect. You see, the ultimate example being human redemption by divine crucifixion. I mean, who's going to think of that? But he does this kind of thing all the time. When in Acts 23, verse 11, the Lord told Paul, as you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. I doubt that Paul envisioned that he'd be doing that as a prisoner. You know, I suspect that when he said that, Paul thought, I will travel there. I may even go, I may even come doing a series. They'll have me there and I'll be talking and everything. Now, how does he get there? He winds up getting there as a prisoner. And we would look at that and say, well, you messed up. You've confined him. You've limited him. But God is always doing things like this, things that we don't expect. And this ought to encourage us. When we find ourselves in difficult situations, you see, we need to look, whatever circumstance or situation we're in, we need to look for how we can serve and glorify God where we are and not go into some kind of spiritual funk about our situation. We need to look at it as, how can I be God's man or God's woman, God's light in this situation that I wouldn't have chosen? I'd have never chosen this. But you are there. And is this a time when God is calling you to shine there? You are my person in that situation. That's Paul in prison. You could look at Paul and say, oh, Paul, it's just a terrible thing. Paul says, I'm put here for a reason. I'm put here for the advancement of the gospel. And you can see that. I thought about Esther in 4:14, the famous Mordecai's famous words to her. Now, she was in an exalted position. But you see the same thing for all positions. Whether it's exalted, whether it's a bummer, whether it's dark, whether the sun's shining. As he said to her, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. God has been at work to put you right here. Now, sometimes it's a situation where, but I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in prison. But he says, but you're there, you see, and you are my person in that circumstance. And just like Paul said, we need to look for how can we be God's man or God's woman in that circumstance. And Paul goes on and he elaborates on the manner in which his circumstances advanced the gospel. He says, I want you to know that I'm put here for the advancement of the gospel. What's happened to me, my circumstances really turned out for the advancement of the gospel. Well, how did that happen, Paul? How has your circumstance served to advance the gospel? And he tells us that the whole palace guard. Now, how do you think you'd get into the palace guard? Do you think you just walk up and say, hey, I'd like an audience with the palace guard? Well, Paul winds up in jail, so he's in the belly of the beast. He's in the belly of the beast. And Paul says the whole palace guard and everyone else involved in his incarceration, everybody that has anything to do with him in prison, they understand that he was in chains because of Jesus. He's not in chains, he's not in prison because he's a criminal. They quickly came to understand that the reason he's here is because of his conviction that Jesus is Lord and has been raised from the dead. That's what led to Paul's being here, and the fact that he was willing to suffer, to be imprisoned solely for his allegiance to Christ. That was a powerful witness. Well, how's it serve to advance the gospel? Well, in the first place, everybody here has come to understand that I am enduring suffering and hardship solely because I'm convinced that Jesus is Lord. You see, now that resonates, that gets people's attention when they see that kind of thing. Faith that deep, faith that genuine, that gets people's attention. Justin Martyr, you may know that name. Justin Martyr was one of the people known as second century apologists, those who defended the Christian faith. He's perhaps the best known, perhaps the most influential. And he wrote that as a pagan, his name Justin Martyr, you understand what happened to him, right? I mean, that's pretty much tells you what happened to him. But he writes in his second apology about how greatly impressed he was when he was a pagan. He was greatly impressed with the courage of Christians in the face of death. He says in that apology, he says, for I myself too, when I was delighting in the doctrines of Plato and heard the Christians slandered, you know, they said all kinds of things about Christians. All kinds of things about him. He said, when I heard them slandered and saw them fearless of death, and of all other things which are counted fearful, all the tortures, all the difficulties that they suffered. When I saw them in that situation, he said, I perceived that it was impossible that they could be living in wickedness and pleasure as it was alleged they were. He says, for what sensual or intemperate man, or who that counts it good to feast on human flesh, that was another charge brought against them, who could welcome death, that he might be deprived of his enjoyments and would not rather continue always the present life and attempt to escape the observation of the rulers, and much less would he denounce himself when the consequence would be death. Now here's a pagan who's looking at these Christians who says, man, these guys really believe this is true. And it influenced him. And Paul is saying that in my imprisonment, I was able to show the reality and the depth of my conviction that Jesus is Lord, and that message preached. You see, that message preached. Then he says that most of the brothers, he says, well, is there anything else about how your imprisonment advanced the gospel? He says, yeah. Most of the brothers were emboldened by his chains to preach the word even more fearlessly. You see, the fortitude of a leader in the face of unjust treatment, it often spurs those within the movement to greater zeal and greater courage. You consider the situation of the great witnesses. Hebrews 11:32 12-2, where it says, "And what more shall we say, for time will fail me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about both David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edges of the sword, were made strong from weakness, became mighty in war, put armies of foreigners to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, but others were tortured, not accepting release, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others received a trial of mockings and whippings, and even of chains and prison. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They died by murder of the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in skins of goats, being destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and in caves and in the holes in the ground. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive the promised God, having provided something better for us, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we have such a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, do you see how it empowers, it strengthens to see other brothers and sisters who are willing to suffer because of the truth that Jesus is Lord? That empowers people. It strengthens them. The opposite is caving in, and you weaken the hands of your brothers and sisters. You see, so Paul is saying that by my faithfulness here, that not only did that show those who are here and close to me in dealing with my incarceration, that I'm here just because of my conviction of who Jesus is, but I also emboldened the brothers and sisters to preach even more fearlessly. He inspired the brothers by putting Christ above all else, even liberty and life. He inspired them. Now, this should tell us something about the potential influence of a sacrificially committed life. This ought to tell us something. If we want to influence the world toward Christ, and if we want to encourage those around us to pursue Christ more zealously, we cannot cave in when our obedience, when it costs us something. Do you see that if our Christian commitment and conviction, if as soon as it becomes the least bit painful to be a Christian, we wind up abandoning the faith or compromising on it, well, that says to the world that your God is not worth very much. If I'm not willing to endure something for him, well, then it says, well, your God is he's just a dime store kind of thing. He's really not worth much. And then Paul goes on in 15 to 18. He says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The ones do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for a defense of the gospel, but the other ones proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not with a pure motive, expecting to stir up trouble by my chains. What does it matter? Only that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is being proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. You see, some of those who were stimulated by Paul's imprisonment to preach more fervently, they were doing so with mixed motives. You see, they were stimulated. They were preaching more fervently, but they were doing it with mixed motives. He says they preached Christ out of envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition. They were competing with Paul in the presentation of the gospel. They were seeking to gain status and elevation at Paul's expense. Now, the phrase in verse 17 that in the NIV is translated not sincerely, I think that throws us off, because we tend to think, well, they're preaching not sincerely. They don't really believe the gospel. That's not it at all. It means not with a pure motive. They sincerely believed the gospel message they were preaching, but part of their motive for doing that was to elevate themselves above Paul. That's what they're doing. They had mixed motives. They wanted to rise above Paul and put Paul down so they could be looked at as big shots at Paul's expense. And by implication, from verse 16, these competitive preachers, they did not appreciate that Paul's imprisonment was a divine appointment in which he was faithfully discharging his ministry to the Gentiles. He was in that situation at the will of God. And he was serving in that situation. Instead, they looked at it as a failure. They saw it as a failure, as some kind of hindrance to the spread of the gospel. Judging from chapter 1, verse 12, where Paul wants to set the record straight, you see that negative spin on Paul's imprisonment had apparently reached Philippi. That's why Paul says, I want you to know, brothers, that what's happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Because that negative spin these people were putting on it, that no, Paul's situation is a hindrance, a detriment. He messed up. He's not really, the cream of the crop. I am. You see, I am. Now they supposed that they could stir up trouble for Paul by his chains. Now this is more commonly translated, they could stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And you can certainly translate it that way, but it makes more sense to me to see Paul's imprisonment as the basis on which they were causing trouble for him. They were using the fact of his imprisonment to denigrate him, to say that he was a failure. And that's what they're doing. As Gerald Hawthorne translates it in his commentary, they think they will stir up trouble because I am in prison. And I think that captures the sense better. D.A. Carson, in his exposition of Philippians, he says, one can easily imagine the reasoning of Paul's critics. Depending on how this case turns out, Paul's appeal to the emperor could bring Christianity into ill repute. Paul is constantly rushing headlong into things where a wiser, cooler head would have been cautious. Why did he have to go up to Jerusalem and get himself arrested anyway? He knew how much he was held in contempt there. Surely there was a better way. Surely, for somebody who had more spiritual insight, surely there was a better way to go. Push Paul down. You see, push Paul down and make Paul look, compared to me, to look less in terms of, comparison to me. Now, whoever these competitive preachers were, whoever they were, it's worth noting they weren't Judaizers. They were not Judaizers because Paul says that despite their impure motives, they preach Christ. You see, they preach Christ, and judging by Galatians chapter 1, Paul does not consider the Judaizers to be preaching the gospel at all. They're preaching a false gospel. See, so whoever these guys are, they're preaching the gospel. They're simply doing it from this mixed motivation. And the point I take from this is that we have to be careful. We have to be careful that our good works aren't motivated by a desire to outshine somebody else. You see, our good and noble things that we do, that somehow I want to do it so I can be thought of more highly than somebody else around me. We have to be really careful about that. We have to be careful about this like spiritual one-upmanship. You see, that spirit and that attitude. Now, this is a problem, of course. It's more acute among people of higher profile. Those who teach, those who preach, those who lead. You see, this idea of trying to elevate oneself relative to others. And it's just a danger. It's a spiritual danger. And I think Paul is warning us here. We have to watch out for that. We have to be careful. We get into this competitive kind of thing with preachers and teachers. Now, Paul rejoiced in the preaching of the gospel, even though it was done at his expense. Now, isn't that an amazing thing? I mean, they are trashing Paul as I read this. They are using Paul's situation to put him down, to elevate themselves. And yet Paul's spirit is, I'm rejoicing that the gospel message is being preached. He could swallow the small-mindedness of preachers who were intent on overshadowing him, as long as they were driven by that competition to preach Christ to a dying world. He could swallow that. If it motivated them to go and preach the message of Jesus Christ to a dying world. As Carson comments again, he says, Paul's example is impressive and clear. Put the advance of the gospel at the center of your aspirations. Our own comfort, our bruised feelings, our reputations, our misunderstood motives, all of these are insignificant in comparison with the advance and splendor of the gospel. As Christians, we are called upon to put the advance of the gospel at the very center of our aspirations. What are your aspirations? To make money? To get married? To travel? To see your grandchildren grow up? To find a new job? To retire early? None of these are inadmissible. None is to be despised. The question is whether these aspirations become so devouring that the Christian's central aspiration is squeezed to the periphery or choked out of existence entirely. You see? And I see from Paul and his spirit and his attitude here that what motivated him and what really lit his fire was the spreading of this message about Jesus Christ. And so I see in that Paul saying, look, and as I said, they're still preaching Christ. Okay, so that what Paul is saying doesn't mean that we should overlook heresies. Just as long as somebody says the word Jesus, well, then we should rejoice. No, there are things like heretical teachings. And so it's not that they're preaching Christ. And if somebody's preaching the truth of Jesus, then we need to celebrate that. Of course, in rejoicing over the result, you know that Paul is in no way condoning the motives, right? He's not condoning their motives. In chapter 2, verse 3, he makes clear that they're to do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty conceit. You see, the how, what was motivating them to preach, that wasn't the object of Paul's joy. That wasn't it. The fact of the preaching, that was the object of his joy. You see, they had impure motives and those things need to be dealt with. But the fact they were preaching Christ is a great joy for Paul. And that needs to be our center and our aspiration. In conclusion, that magic phrase. In conclusion. Now, just go on for another 30 minutes. Okay. Now, we need to be the Lord's man or woman in whatever situation we find ourselves. However dark it may be, however difficult it may be, we need to look in that circumstance for the opportunity to serve the Lord. Why am I here and how can I serve you? How in this particular situation and difficulty and hardship, what do you want me to do here? How do you want me to shine in this dark world, in this situation I find myself in? We need to ask ourselves that. And we need to keep our motives pure in serving. We need to keep our eyes fixed on glorifying the Lord and not slip into this kind of spiritual one-upmanship. We need to be motivated by Him. He's the one who's died for us. What we're interested in is His glory. And that's what we need to do. And we need to be about sharing the gospel. The greatest news there's ever been. We have to guard against that purpose and that mission getting squeezed out by other things. God wants all people to be saved, and He's called us to bring His saving message to a hell-bound world. And we need to be about that. Now, as we close, our typical custom, I invite you, if you have any need, anything we can help you with, when we sing, you come up and we'll pray and do whatever we can to help you. Thanks.